Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kimberly Vince-Cruz of Destination Analysts. We are Visit St. Pete-Clearwater's research partner who has been conducting this visitor research over the past year. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so thrilled to have you to take a look at some of the key visitor insights that have emerged from this research so far in 2018. We'll get started in just a couple minutes to allow for a couple of other attendees to join. So please hang on tight and we will get started shortly. Hi everyone, this is Kim Vince-Cruz again with Destination Analysts. Hopefully you can all hear. Just want to make sure that the audio is working fine on your end. And like I mentioned, we're going to give it one more minute to allow for some of the registrants to join us, and then we'll get started.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon to everyone on the line. This is an exciting first for us and our research partner, Destination Analysts, a webinar to walk through this latest visitor research. This is Leroy Bridges, Vice President of Digital and Communications with Visit St. Pete-Clearwater. First off, I want to start by thanking all of you on the line for giving us the ability to survey visitors at your locations and businesses. Without you, the data that you're going to see wouldn't be possible. And it really just starts with that partnership. And this webinar is a big thanks to you. All of you are seeing this information first, before the rest of industry, and it's because of that partnership. In particular, we do have some very, very recent red tide perception research that is going to be included in this. I know of high interest to everyone, considering what we've kind of gone through and dealt with over the last 2 months or so. We will also be doing a round 2 of this call for all of the industry in early January, so stand by on that if you have somebody else in the organization or someone else who's interested, and I believe we're recording this as well. With that, thank you guys all, and I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly and Elizabeth with Destination Analysts. Well, you may hear us call them DA at times, and that's who we're referring to. So with that, over to them. They're going to walk through the research. They're the smart people on this call, not me. So thanks again to everyone. Ladies, take it away.
Thanks so much, Leroy.
Thank you, Leroy. This is Elizabeth with Destination Analysts. So before we dive into the data, a quick overview on how to use some of the functions of GoToWebinar. So this slide here shows you how to collapse and open back up the browser control panel with this orange button, and then also how to ask a question. If you think of something as we're going through the findings that you'd like to know more about or have clarified, please enter it into the chat box. We will go through questions at the end of our webinar. And finally, the audio preferences, in case you have a weak signal on your internet, you can choose to dial in on your phone instead of using your computer function, and then you can use that as a phone call. In case there's any drop-off, you can use your link from registration to rejoin the webinar. So overview of what we'll be discussing today. We will spend the bulk of our time discussing the top-line findings from visitor research that's been collected to date. Then we will talk a little bit about red tide perceptions, and we'll close with a question and answer session. And during the Q&A, we'd love to hear feedback and questions, things you'd like to hear addressed in the future. As Leroy mentioned, we are planning to do another webinar in January, and during this time we can incorporate more information that is most of interest to you. The objectives of this visitor research is to create in-depth profiles of visitors to Pinellas County. So we're looking at things like why visitors are coming, where they're staying and for how long, the composition of their travel group, what kind of activities they're participating in and attractions most of interest that they're visiting, their evaluation of the St. Pete-Clearwater brand, as well as detailed spending and information about travel planning resources, and finally their satisfaction. A little overview of the Visitor Intercept survey, which of course you all are somewhat familiar with. So we've had our survey team working every weekend for the past year at locations around the St. Pete-Clearwater area to randomly select and interview visitors. And in order to be eligible, they need to reside outside of Pinellas County. So just a short list of some of the sites that we've surveyed at the most this past year. In addition to these sites, we've also been surveying at a number of events around Pinellas County. So we'll start off looking at where the visitors are coming from. So the top domestic visitor markets represented are Tampa, Sarasota, and Orlando. Outside of Florida, the top markets are Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, and Indianapolis. Of the visitor sample, we found about 10% to be international, with the top markets being Canada and the United Kingdom, followed by Germany. Quick look at demographics. We see the average age is about 52, with an average household income of $82,000. Ethnicity, about 84% Caucasian, followed by around 6% Latino, Hispanic, 4% Black, African American, and about 2% Asian. Sample was pretty evenly distributed, female and male, about 70% married and partnered, and about 16% children under 18. 87% heterosexual, and about 3% LGBTQ. Then a quick look at the demographics by place of stay or day trip. So the three categories you see in these tables, hotel, VFR, and day trip. VFR stands for visiting friends and relatives. So we see that hotel guests overall have the highest annual household income, and they're the most likely to be married and have children under 18, as indicated in blue on the left. Looking at the composition of travel parties, we see the typical size of travel parties is about 2.9 people. And of these people, 23% of the groups have children under 18. Overall, the most common travel party composition was a couple, followed by immediate family, and but just over 10% traveling solo. We found 4 in 10 visitors staying overnight in St. Pete-Clearwater, about 60% coming in on a day trip. Of those who did stay overnight, we find 20% are staying overnight in a St. Pete-Clearwater area hotel. The average length of stay was 3.9 days. We see that VFR have the longest stay on average, with about 8 days in market, as opposed to hotel guests who tended to stay an average of 5 days. As to why visitors are coming, we see that the primary reason is leisure. We have half our respondents saying their trip is best described as a vacation, and another 1/4 were in the area to visit friends or family. About 5% were in town for business, whether a conference or trade show or other government business travel. Looking at trip spending, we see an average daily spend of about $92 per person per day in the St. Pete-Clearwater area. So this figure is based on the average reported daily spending per travel party, which is $236.11, which is covering an average of 2.7 travelers. So we can see the breakdown by type of category, restaurants being the #1 spend category, about $77 per day per travel party, followed by hotel, retail store purchases, and other entertainment and sightseeing. Looking at transportation, we find a majority of visitors coming to the St. Pete-Clearwater area via car, whether a personal automobile or a rental car. And so in the chart on the left, we see the arrival and departure in the blue and orange. And we see that a number of airline visitors are coming about half by air, but departing by airline figure is about half of that. The average visitor made the decision to visit St. Pete-Clearwater about 2 months in advance of their actual travel date. Then on the right, we have the most commonly used travel planning resources. So we have one on the left, we see those resources that they used prior to arriving in the area. Most commonly used resource, user-generated content and review websites such as Yelp and TripAdvisor. These are continued to be used in market, although the rate decreases a little bit. Other top planning resources used prior to coming to town were online travel agencies, Expedia, Travelocity, and so on, and of course the opinions of friends or relatives, which we see later on as an important factor to a number of visitors in their decision to come visit. In terms of official St. Pete-Clearwater area resources, about 1.5% using the official website prior to advance, and this figure actually goes up in market. As for the most liked aspect, the favorite parts of the trip for visitors, we see that their most liked qualities and attributes of St. Pete-Clearwater are the beaches and attractions, including museums, aquariums, etc., and the tropical climate. So these were the most commonly stated favorite parts of visitors when asked what they like most. Hotel guests were most likely to say that the beaches were the most liked aspect for them, while VFRs were more likely to cite the tropical climate, and day trippers in particular like the attractions. And next we look at on the right how visitors feel in St. Pete-Clearwater. So we asked an open-ended question, what one word or phrase best describes how you feel in the St. Pete-Clearwater area? And #1 response is calm or relaxed. So this is a place that they love to visit in order to just decompress and sit back and take a deep breath and enjoy their vacation. So another 30% are happy, and so on. So really, really positive feelings and associations with the destination. We also ask what services or additional attractions might enhance their experience. Overall, we see again that the vast majority of respondents say that, in fact, the destination needs no particular improvement. They think it's great the way it is. However, those who did have specific suggestions were most likely to cite they'd prefer more parking options, cheaper parking, and more public transport options. In terms of trip satisfaction, we see just about all visitors surveyed said they were satisfied or very satisfied with their overall trip experience. They rated their likelihood to return very high, an average of 9.4 out of 10, and they're also very likely to recommend the area to other travelers, their friends and family, an average of 9.5 out of 10. So in this chart, we see the Q2 in blue and the 2018 year-to-date data. So this is looking a little bit at some of the dates when the red tide began. We'll talk more about this a little bit later. But just to give you a sense of not a huge discrepancy between satisfaction levels happening, those who were here during some of the red tide dates, not having a major influence on their satisfaction. So next we have a few slides for you showing different segments. So this first one we have up here, the beachgoer, are showing visitors who said their primary motivation for visiting the St. Pete-Clearwater area was to visit beaches that suit their taste. So some particular callouts about beachgoers, they have an average length of stay of 4.4 days, which is a little bit longer of some of the other segments we look at, such as the arts and culture visitor, who tend to stay about half that length, 1.7 days on average. And so this visitor segment is defined by those who say their primary motivation for visiting was to engage in arts and cultural offerings. So that's on the bottom left, the gray box. These are the factors important to their destination decisions. So we can see for them, beaches that suit my taste is a very small segment that's driving them to visit, and they're coming for the cultural offerings. So there's some really interesting differences between these segments that we're not going to talk about all these right now, but these are available in the published reports of St. Pete-Clearwater. So something interesting to look at. When we look at the differences by generation, we see that the millennial visitors are most likely to visit museums compared to some of the other, their older generations. In terms of the Gen X visitor, 37.7% traveling with children, much higher than the average of the other segments.
This is Kim speaking here. One other interesting thing in looking at the generational segments, when we look at the top activities, the Gen Xers, you'll see on the bottom right corner of this page, one of their top activities was swimming, interestingly, and this was not one of the top 4 activities for millennials or baby boomers.
Another call out for baby boomers, one of the major factors important to their decision to visit is the friends and family in the area that they're coming to visit. So this is reflective of, we see especially in the winter months, we have a lot of older travelers from the Midwest coming to town, and it's kind of an effect of the more people that they know, recommendations are furthered and has a really positive influence on this group. And family traveler, we see this segment was defined by those who visited with children under 18. And for them, again, beaches that suit their taste and attractions in the area are the highest drivers for them. So now Kim is going to talk a little bit about the red tide perceptions.
Great. So this is Kim with Destination Analysts. And what we're going to share with you are some key findings about red tide based on the State of the American Traveler Study. And our State of the American Traveler Study is a quarterly tracking study that we conduct. We've been conducting the State of the American Traveler since 2006. And what we do is we study over 2,000 American leisure travelers. We ask them questions about their travel opinions, their motivations, behaviors, perception, sentiment, whether they intend to travel more or less or spend more or less for travel in the next year. And in our most recent edition of the State of the American Traveler, conducted in October 2018, we included a couple of questions specific to the red tide. The first of these being whether or not these American leisure travelers were aware of red tide. Specifically, we asked them, prior to taking the survey, had you heard of this year's red tide situation? And we also shared with these survey respondents a description of what red tide was. About half of all American leisure travelers surveyed reported that they had indeed heard of the red tide situation. So half of these travelers were aware. And then we take this a little step further and we ask how red tide has impacted their likelihood of visiting the Florida Gulf Coast in the next year. And we presented them with a statement and asked them to fill in the blank using a scale from much less likely to much more likely. And the statement was, as a result of the red tide, I am blank to visit the Florida Gulf Coast in the next year. And as you see on the chart on the right, the largest proportion of American leisure travelers, 50%, reported that they are neutral. They're neither more nor less likely to visit the Gulf Coast in the next year. Essentially, red tide did not affect their likelihood of visiting. But as you see towards the left of the chart, there are about 40% of these American leisure travelers who reported that they're either slightly less likely, or much less likely to visit the Gulf Coast in the next year as a result of red tide. So what we did was we did a little bit of an analysis and we looked at just that segment, much less likely. So that 17.8% of American leisure travelers who said that they were much less likely to visit the Gulf Coast in the next year. And we also compared that to this largest proportion of 50% who said that they're neither more nor less likely to visit. And a couple of interesting insights emerged in looking at these two different segments. In comparing these two, those who said that they were much less likely versus those who were neutral, we see that these American leisure travelers who were much less likely to visit the Florida Gulf Coast in the next 12 months were more likely to live in an urban area. They plan to spend less on leisure travel in the next 12 months. They find that using their mobile phone for travel planning is very easy. They also frequently use their phone for travel inspiration and travel ideas. Those who were much less likely to visit the Gulf Coast in the next 12 months compared to those who were neutral also strongly prefer to use a mobile phone to research activities and events and attractions for a leisure trip. This segment is also strongly prefers to use a mobile phone in researching accommodations for a leisure trip. And then lastly, those who said they were much less likely to visit the Gulf Coast in the next year were also much more likely to regularly use Instagram compared to those who were neutral. And so that concludes our sharing of the visitor profile insights to date, as well as some key perceptions on red tide. And we'd love to now open it up to any questions. Please feel free to chat any questions in your chat box, and we'll be happy to answer them. So one of the first questions that came in comes from Sarah, and she asks whether the participating Intercept host sites are able to receive site-specific data. And yes, we are able to share that. What we can do is we will have our team run what's called a data cross-tabulation, in which we can look at just those St. Pete Clearwater visitors who were surveyed at your specific location or attraction, and we can share that data cross-tabulation with you, and also highlight any interesting insights that we see in looking at that data. Should anyone wish for data specific to their site, please feel free to contact us directly at Destination Analysts, and we'd be happy to share that with you. Any other questions about the data or about red tide, about visitors or anything? Feel free to chat any observations or anything that you were particularly surprised or not surprised by.
And again, as we mentioned earlier, we would love to hear what is most of interest and most useful for you to learn more about, so we can incorporate that into our next webinar.
So the next question that came through is what we used for the age range in defining the Gen X, so Generation X. So we have 3 different age generations that we look at: baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. And what we did was we asked this by their birth year. So there are specific years in which they were born that we use to define those 3 different segments: millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers. So we will take a look at those specific years and can share those with you. We'll just have to take a closer look at what specific years, what were the cutoff points between those generations. Any other questions, comments, or anything you found particularly interesting? So it doesn't seem to be that there are other questions. However, if any questions do come up, please feel free to contact us at Destination Analysts anytime. Feel free to call or email either me or Elizabeth or anyone on the Destination Analyst team, and we'd be happy to share any site-specific data as well as answer any other questions that you have. We will be providing this deck to Leroy at Visit St. Pete Clearwater. So if anybody would like access to that, he'll be able to share that with you. And thank you again all so much for your time in joining us during this webinar in which we reviewed the visitor profile findings today as well as some perceptions of red tide. And thank you all so much. Like Leroy mentioned earlier, we wouldn't be able to successfully conduct this research without your support and participation and help. So we really, really appreciate it. And we will be in touch with you all soon regarding the next industry webinar in January. And wishing you all a very happy holiday season.
Thank you, everyone.